Robin DiAngelo, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. In her book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm, Robin DiAngelo examines the concept of nice racism, a subtle but harmful form of racism perpetuated by well-intentioned white people. This book's summary highlights how white progressives, despite their professed commitments to diversity and social justice, inadvertently contribute to racial harm through their actions and attitudes. Readers will learn about the inherent privileges that white people possess, the myth of individualism, and the importance of decentering oneself and learning from feedback.
The ugly truth about nice racists. Nice racists often do more harm than overt racists. White people who pride themselves on being woke and liberal can unconsciously perpetrate racial discrimination. When we think of racists, our minds conjure up images of far-right extremists like the Ku Klux Klan, but the truth is that some of the worst perpetrators of racial discrimination are those we'd least suspect. The nice racists, those liberal people who pride themselves on being woke and liberal, are often the worst offenders. They might join diversity committees or hang out with black people to prove they're not racist. They might use compliments that are racist microaggressions like noting how articulate someone is just because they're black. They might move into neighborhoods and gentrify them, displacing black residents. Most nice racists don't see themselves as racist, but they are, and their actions do more harm than those of overt racists. Their good intentions do not solve the intractable problems of racism and white supremacy. The reason they don't see it is simple: they've grown up in a world where racist messaging is everywhere, where they're told subconsciously that they're superior, that they earned all the advantages they enjoy in life, and that black people would prosper if they only tried a bit harder. But the truth is that these are all lies and myths that they need to unlearn, starting with the fact that being nice isn't enough. Pride in being colorblind or not seeing color is not the solution to the problem. We need to be actively conscious of our own prejudices, actively educate ourselves on systemic inequality, and actively work for change. Otherwise, racism will persist in insidious ways, and overall progress will be slowed. It's time to face the undeniable fact that even those of us who consider ourselves to be progressive or nice can perpetrate acts of prejudice and must take responsibility for the harm we cause. Only by acknowledging this truth and taking action to unlearn and act differently can we actively work to bring about a paradigm shift. Nice racism and the myth of individualism. The concept of nice racism persists because of the myth of individualism. The idea that racism is a personal issue for some and not for others is deeply flawed. The privileges enjoyed by white people are inextricably linked to centuries of policies that have perpetuated white supremacy. This reality is hard to accept because it forces individuals to acknowledge that their resources and success were obtained unfairly. Giving up the myth of individualism is crucial for dismantling one's own racism. The complex relationship between white privilege and oppression through poverty. In this book, Robin DiAngelo discusses how white people can experience racism and oppression while still benefiting from white privilege. Growing up in extreme poverty, DiAngelo and her family were discriminated against, but her white skin gave her more opportunities to climb out of poverty. However, the racism she internalized as a child still shapes her behavior, making her collude with white supremacy. DiAngelo emphasizes the importance of centering race in discussions of oppression to better understand the complexities of intersectionality. The danger of nice racists. The book exposes the danger of nice racists, who lack the humility and willingness to confront their own racism. The author shares a story of a black executive who was unfairly fired for calling out her boss's racial bias. White people tend to be ignorant of the experiences of people of color due to their segregation, lack of real-world knowledge, and exposure to a media culture that centers white experiences. This ignorance leads to inaccurate assumptions, such as underestimating the wealth gap between white and black families. In addition, white people rarely have to answer to black people, which means they have little experience in dealing with the discomfort of being called out and held accountable for racism. Instead, they hide behind insidious niceness, which hinders progress in tackling white supremacy. The book's message is clear: addressing racism requires a willingness to deal with conflict and respond with humility, even if it's unpleasant. The deceptive nature of color. Celebrate credentialing. The practice of using people of color to prove one's non-racist stance, known as color celebrate credentialing, is a misnomer. Author Robin DiAngelo posits that this is a common tactic used by well-meaning, nice racists to prove their progressive status as white individuals. Unfortunately, proximity to black individuals cannot be used as a measure of one's racism. The behavior actually tokenizes and objectifies black people while allowing white individuals to ignore the importance of true, lasting relationships and integration. This deceptive practice derails conversations about racial justice and must be addressed in order to move forward towards a truly inclusive society. The pitfalls of trying to outwoke others. In this book, the author shares a personal experience of how trying to prove her wokeness backfired and how it continues to happen in anti-racist work. The urge to outwoke others is counterproductive and harmful as it replicates the very racism one is trying to distance themselves from. White activists need to be aware, alert, and constantly learning rather than focusing on their own credentials if they truly want to make a difference. Decentering yourself and learning from feedback. Imagine receiving feedback on your racist behavior from a black coworker and your first response is to defend yourself or feel shame. These reactions center your own feelings and do not acknowledge the content of the feedback. Instead, practice decentering yourself and learning from the feedback. Recognize that your black colleague is taking a risk in sharing their experiences and do not burden them with your emotional response. Accept responsibility for your behavior, thank them for their feedback, and take steps to make amends. The role of shame in anti-racism. Feelings are socially constructed and controlled by society, including reactions to racism. White progressives often cling to shame instead of taking action to address racism. Shame allows them to avoid accountability for their actions and absolves them of taking steps towards change. In her book, Robin DiAngelo explores the concept of shame and its impact on anti-racist work. She highlights how feelings are not only natural but also shaped by societal norms and biases. DiAngelo examines how white people often perceive anger differently based on race and how some emotions are considered more acceptable than others. The author then goes on to explain why shame is often the go-to emotion for many white progressives. Shame allows individuals to feel like they are moral people aware of racism without having to take any real action against it. They can elicit sympathy and support from others while not being held accountable for their actions. However, when used as a catalyst for action, shame can be a healthy and necessary part of anti-racist work. White people have to confront their role in society's racial hierarchy and engage in the harm they have caused. Shame becomes a problem when it is used to avoid accountability and recenter white progressives at the expense of those they have harmed. Overall, DiAngelo stresses that addressing racism requires more than just acknowledging it. It requires action and accountability, and shame should not be used as an excuse for inaction. Walk the talk. Accountability and action in anti-racism. After George Floyd's murder at the hands of the police, anti-racism movements saw a significant rise, with people of all races joining in to condemn racism. However, simply knowing the terminology of racial justice is not enough. It is essential to align our actions with our values and make sure our accountability is in check. To become accountable, one must recognize how their own white fragility can derail anti-racist work and embrace their vulnerability. It's crucial to surround oneself with supportive, like-minded people and seek feedback from people of color to avoid causing harm and making amends. Money talks, too. Supporting racial justice organizations and promoting the work of black intellectuals and artists is as important as walking the talk. Allyship is an everyday practice, not a state of being. Take action to support anti-racism and show up for change.
DiAngelo's book reminds us that nice racism can be even more damaging than overt bigotry because it operates in stealth. The key to dismantling this insidious form of racial harm lies in self-awareness, a willingness to confront one's own racism, and acknowledging the benefits white people gain from systemic racism. It is crucial to create circles of support, listen to the experiences of others, and take actionable steps to align one's values with one's actions. By challenging nice racism, we can begin to work towards a more inclusive and just society.